There's a category of semiconductor that, on paper, barely exists. If you pull shipment records from 2023 into early 2025, customs data, export filings, even third-party logistics trackers, you'll find GPUs moving from Taiwan, South Korea, and the United States into China in declining volumes. That part is expected. Export controls tightened, licenses were denied, the flow slowed. But then something strange happens. China's data center capacity doesn't slow with it. It climbs. Not dramatically, not in a way that triggers headlines, but steadily enough that if you line up power consumption data from provincial grids with procurement disclosures from major cloud providers, the math stops balancing. You're looking at infrastructure expansion without a corresponding rise in imported high-end chips. That gap is the story. Because data centers don't run on intent. They run on silicon. And high-performance AI workloads, training large models, running inference at scale, require very specific types of chips. Not generic processors, not legacy hardware. You need accelerators built for parallel computation. You need something in the class of NVIDIA's A100 or H100, or at least something trying to imitate them. Those are exactly the chips that export controls were designed to choke off. So the assumption, widely repeated, rarely examined, is simple. China is constrained. Temporarily adapting maybe, but structurally limited. Less access means less capability. It sounds reasonable. It's also incomplete. Because while shipments dropped, installations didn't. Take provincial disclosures. In late 2024, multiple Chinese regions, Guizhou, Inner Mongolia, parts of Hebei, reported expansions in intelligent computing capacity. The terminology matters. They're not saying data centers. They're specifying AI-oriented compute clusters. Measured in exaflops equivalents, some of these clusters suggest hardware density that shouldn't be achievable under current import restrictions. You could argue they're exaggerating. Local governments do that. But then you cross-reference with power infrastructure upgrades, substation expansions, dedicated energy allocations, cooling system tenders. These are harder to fake because they involve physical build-outs and third-party contractors. And they align with the compute claims. Which brings us back to the missing shipments. If the chips aren't entering through conventional channels, then one of three things is happening. First possibility, stockpiling. China imported aggressively before controls tightened, building a reserve large enough to sustain current expansion. There's some truth here. In 2022, imports of high-end GPUs spiked. Companies front-loaded purchases anticipating restrictions. But stockpiles deplete, and more importantly, they age. AI models evolve quickly. Training requirements scale. Hardware from 2 or 3 years ago doesn't disappear, but it doesn't explain continued expansion at this pace, not on its own. Second possibility, smuggling and gray markets. Chips routed through third countries, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, re-exported under different classifications. This is happening. There are documented cases. But it's noisy, inefficient, and limited in volume. You don't quietly supply national-scale data center growth through suitcase logistics and shell distributors. The friction is too high. Which leaves the third option. The chips are being produced, assembled, or at least finalized in ways that avoid appearing as finished high-performance processors in any shipment record. Not invisible, just unrecognizable at the stage where the world is looking. Think about how a modern chip moves. Design might happen in Shenzhen, fabrication in Taiwan or South Korea. Packaging, this is the part people underestimate, can occur somewhere else entirely. And packaging isn't just putting a chip in a box. Advanced packaging defines performance now. Chiplets, interposers, high-bandwidth memory integration. This is where a processor becomes an AI accelerator. Control the packaging stage, and you control what the chip is when it crosses a border. A partially completed unit might be classified differently, less restricted, less scrutinized. It doesn't trip the same export rules because, technically, it isn't the final product those rules describe. Only later, inside China, within domestic facilities, does it become what it was always meant to be, an AI chip. There are hints of this in procurement language, references to advanced packaging services increasing domestically, investments into firms specializing in 2.5D and 3D integration. These aren't glamorous headlines. They read like industrial footnotes, but they matter because they sit at the exact junction where classification meets capability. And once you start looking at it this way, the absence in shipment data stops being a mystery. It becomes a design choice. The system isn't failing to track the chips, it's tracking the wrong stage of their existence. There's a counter-argument worth taking seriously. Some analysts argue that domestic Chinese chips, companies like Huawei's HiSilicon or Biren, are filling the gap entirely with homegrown designs. That would mean no need for hidden supply chains, just internal substitution. It's appealing, it's clean. It's also not fully convincing, because even the most advanced domestic designs still depend at some level on external tooling, fabrication processes, or components that sit within the global semiconductor ecosystem. Full independence isn't a switch you flip, it's a spectrum, and China hasn't reached the far end of it yet. So if domestic production isn't sufficient, and imports are restricted, and yet capacity is growing, then the system in between has changed, quietly, deliberately, and in a way that doesn't show up where most people are looking. That's where part 2 needs to go, because this doesn't stop at packaging. It extends into how entire supply chains are being restructured, not to be faster or cheaper, but to be harder to observe. What makes this harder to see is that nothing about it looks dramatic at ground level. No single shipment raises a flag. No one facility looks like it's doing something extraordinary. Each piece, taken in isolation, feels routine. Contract manufacturing here, component sourcing there, a packaging upgrade announced in a regional industrial park. But when you line them up, the pattern tightens. Start with advanced packaging. Around 2023, Chinese state-backed funds began increasing allocations not to chip design firms, which get the headlines, but to packaging specialists. Companies working on 2.5D interposers, chiplet integration, high bandwidth memory stacking. On paper, this sits downstream of fabrication, lower prestige, lower scrutiny. In reality, it's where performance is assembled. A processor's raw die isn't enough anymore. What determines whether it can train an AI model efficiently is how it's connected to memory, how multiple dies communicate, how heat is managed under sustained load. These are packaging problems. Solve them well enough, and a collection of less restricted components starts behaving like a restricted one. That's the pivot. Instead of trying to import a finished high-end GPU, which triggers export controls, you move smaller, less sensitive elements across borders. Logic dies that fall under lower thresholds. Memory modules sourced separately. Interconnect components that individually don't look strategic. Each piece passes through the system without friction. The transformation happens later. There's precedent for this kind of strategy, just not at this scale. In the early 2000s, certain telecom equipment manufacturers reclassified components to navigate tariff regimes. Nothing illegal on paper, just a different way of assembling value across jurisdictions. The difference now is that we're not talking about tariffs. We're talking about technology denial regimes designed to limit computational power. And those regimes are still written around finished products. Consider how export rules are structured. The U.S. Commerce Department's October 2022 and October 2023 controls define thresholds: interconnect bandwidth, performance density, floating point operations per second. If a chip exceeds those thresholds, it requires a license to export to China. But those definitions assume the chip is identifiable at export. They assume the performance characteristics are measurable at the point of shipment. Break the chip into parts, and that assumption weakens. A logic die on its own doesn't cross the same threshold. Memory modules certainly don't. Even certain interconnect components can move with fewer restrictions depending on classification. None of these, individually, violate the rule set. They sit below the line. The line was drawn around a different architecture. So what you get is a system where compliance exists at the component level, while capability emerges at the system level. That's not a loophole in the casual sense. It's a structural mismatch between how regulation is written and how modern hardware is built. There are signals this is happening beyond China's borders as well. Look at Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Vietnam, even parts of Thailand. Over the past 2 years, there's been a noticeable increase in semiconductor-related investment, particularly in back-end processes. Not full fabrication plants, that would draw attention, but facilities focused on testing, assembly, packaging. Officially, this is diversification. Companies spreading risk, moving some operations out of China, building resilience after the pandemic. That explanation holds, partially. But the same geography also functions as a buffer zone. Components can move into these regions, undergo intermediate processes, and then be routed onward. The origin and classification shift subtly at each stage. By the time something arrives in China, it doesn't resemble the controlled item described in export regulations. And because each step is legal within its jurisdiction, enforcement becomes fragmented. No single country sees the whole chain. There's a case study buried in earnings calls that illustrates this without stating it directly. In late 2024, a major Asian packaging firm reported a surge in demand for heterogeneous integration services tied to AI and high-performance computing customers in multiple regions. They didn't name China. They didn't need to. The growth rate, double digits year over year, lined up almost perfectly with the increase in Chinese data center build-outs. Correlation isn't proof, but the alignment is tight enough that you have to ask what else could be driving it. Now step back for a second, because the obvious pushback here is scale. Even if this system exists, componentized imports, distributed packaging, regional intermediaries, can it really support national-level AI expansion? Or are we looking at a niche workaround being mistaken for a structural shift? That's a fair question. The answer sits in how AI workloads have evolved. Training frontier models, the kind that make headlines, does require massive clusters of top-tier GPUs. But a significant portion of demand isn't at that extreme. It's inference. It's mid-tier training. It's industry-specific models that don't need the absolute cutting edge, just something good enough at scale. If you can assemble hardware that reaches, say, 70 to 80% of the performance of a restricted chip, but you can deploy it widely and consistently, the aggregate effect is substantial. You don't need perfection, you need volume. And volume is exactly what this kind of supply chain is built to deliver. Not elegant, not optimized for peak performance, but resilient under constraint. Pieces moving through different channels, coming together where oversight is weakest. There's another layer to this that doesn't get discussed much: software adaptation. Chinese firms aren't just waiting for hardware. They're adjusting models to run efficiently on whatever hardware they can assemble. Techniques like model pruning, quantization, and distributed training reduce the dependency on top-tier chips. It's not a full substitute, but it lowers the threshold of what counts as usable hardware. So the hardware gap narrows from both sides. Better assembly on one end, lower requirements on the other. At this point, the story stops being about whether China can replace Western chips. That framing is too binary. The more accurate question is whether it can reconfigure the system enough that the absence of those chips doesn't halt progress. And based on the signals, packaging investment, regional supply chain shifts, data center growth, the answer is leaning toward yes. Not perfectly, not without inefficiencies, but enough to keep moving, which leads to an uncomfortable implication for policymakers. Because the controls weren't designed to slow things slightly. They were designed to create a meaningful bottleneck, a pause, time for technological distance to widen. If the bottleneck turns into friction instead, manageable, predictable, engineered around, then the strategy needs to be rethought. That's where the next layer comes in. Because even if this system works today, it introduces its own vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities might matter more than the workaround itself. The system works, but it doesn't come for free. What you gain in opacity, you often lose in efficiency. Take yield rates. When you split production across multiple jurisdictions, logic die here, memory there, packaging somewhere else, you introduce more failure points. Alignment errors, thermal inconsistencies, interconnect defects. In a tightly controlled environment, you can manage these. Spread it out and variance creeps in, quietly but persistently. That matters because AI hardware isn't forgiving. A small drop in yield doesn't just increase cost. It limits how many fully functional units you can deploy at scale. You start compensating, overproducing certain components, accepting lower performance bins, redesigning workloads to tolerate instability. None of this shows up in headline capacity numbers, but it shows up in how efficiently that capacity is used. There's also latency, not the kind inside a chip, but across the supply chain. A component delayed in Malaysia can stall final assembly in Chengdu. A regulatory change in Vietnam can reroute an entire batch. The system becomes more adaptable, yes, but also more sensitive to disruption in places that weren't previously critical. You've traded a single choke point for a network of smaller ones. From a resilience standpoint, that's ambiguous. Harder to shut down entirely, easier to degrade in ways that are difficult to diagnose. And then there's cost. Not just financial cost, though that's rising, but coordination cost. Managing a distributed, semi-obscured supply chain requires layers of intermediaries, legal teams to navigate classification, logistics partners willing to operate in gray zones, redundant pathways in case one route tightens. This is not how you build the most efficient system. It's how you build a system that survives pressure. Which raises a question that doesn't have a clean answer. Is this sustainable, or is it a bridge? Because if it's a bridge, it's buying time for something else. Domestic fabrication, alternative architectures, a breakthrough in process technology. Something that reduces dependence on this fragmented structure. If it's not a bridge, then you're looking at a long-term shift toward supply chains designed less for optimization and more for strategic ambiguity. That has consequences beyond China. Consider how other countries respond once they recognize the pattern. Export controls don't stay static, they evolve. If regulators start focusing on components instead of finished products, memory bandwidth thresholds, interposer specifications, even packaging capabilities, the current workaround tightens. There are already early signals of this. Discussions within policy circles about extending controls to advanced packaging equipment, increased scrutiny on high-bandwidth memory exports, quiet pressure on intermediary countries to align more closely with U.S. restrictions. Nothing definitive yet, but the direction is clear. And if those controls expand, the system we're describing has to adapt again. More fragmentation, more indirection, possibly diminishing returns. There's a second vulnerability, less technical and more strategic: visibility. Ironically, a system designed to avoid observation can become more legible over time. Patterns emerge, trade anomalies get studied, power consumption doesn't lie. Satellite imagery of data center expansion doesn't care how the chips got there. At first, the absence of data is confusing. Eventually, it becomes a signal in itself. Analysts start asking why certain components are moving in unusual volumes, why specific regions are suddenly central to back-end processing, why declared capabilities don't match import profiles. You can hide within noise, but sustained deviation creates its own kind of clarity. And once the pattern is understood, responses become more targeted. That's when this shifts from a clever workaround to an iterative contest. One side adjusts controls, the other reconfigures supply chains. Each cycle adds complexity. Each cycle raises costs. The question then isn't who wins in a simple sense. It's who can absorb the friction longer without compromising their broader system. For the United States and its allies, the cost is in enforcement. Expanding controls without overreaching, without disrupting global supply chains in ways that hurt their own firms, is a delicate balance. Push too far, and you fragment the market you're trying to dominate. For China, the cost is internal. Efficiency losses, coordination burdens, potential technological ceilings if certain components remain out of reach. Neither side gets a clean outcome. There's also something more subtle happening underneath all of this. A shift in how we define technological leadership. For years, the assumption was straightforward. The country with the most advanced nodes, the best chips, the highest performance hardware, wins. Leadership was tied to peak capability. What we're seeing here complicates that. Because if you can't access the absolute best, but you can assemble good enough systems at scale, and you can do it consistently despite external pressure, you create a different kind of advantage. Not dominance, persistence. And persistence, in long cycles like AI infrastructure buildouts, has weight. At this point, I'm not entirely convinced either side has fully internalized what this means. Policy debates still revolve around cutting-edge benchmarks, nanometers, flops, training runs. Those matter, but they're not the whole picture anymore. The system is shifting towards something less visible, less elegant, harder to measure. And that makes it harder to control. Which brings us to the final layer, because all of this, hidden supply chains, adaptive controls, rising friction, points toward a conclusion that isn't as clean as either narrative suggests. If you step back far enough, the argument most people are having about this is slightly off. It's framed as a question of denial. Can the US and its allies deny China access to the highest-end AI chips? That's a clean question. It produces clean policy. And in a narrow sense, the answer might even be yes. But that's not the question that determines outcomes anymore. The real question is slower, less satisfying. Can you deny capability in a system where capability can be assembled, approximated, and distributed across layers you don't fully control? Because if the answer to that is no, or even not completely, then what we're looking at isn't a blockade, it's a drag coefficient. Something that slows progress, raises cost, introduces inefficiency, but doesn't stop motion. And once you see it that way, the data starts to line up. China's AI sector hasn't stalled. It hasn't surged uncontrollably either. It's moving forward at a pace that feels constrained but persistent. New models are being released, not always at the frontier, but competitive enough in specific domains. Data centers keep coming online. Not explosively, not quietly either, just steadily. That word matters more than it sounds, because steady progress under constraint tells you the system has adapted. Not perfectly. There are real limits. Training the largest frontier models still appears harder without direct access to top-tier hardware. Certain research directions slow down. Some companies fall behind. But the floor doesn't collapse. And for a country thinking in decades, that floor matters more than a temporary ceiling. Here's where I think the conversation needs to get more honest. The current strategy assumes that time favors the side enforcing the restrictions, that by slowing China down, you widen the technological gap, making it harder to catch up later. That logic holds if the slowdown compounds, if each year of restriction creates a larger deficit than the last. I'm not fully convinced that's happening. What I see instead is a system absorbing the shock, reconfiguring, and then continuing along a slightly altered path. Less efficient, yes, but also less dependent on the exact points of control the restrictions were designed around. Over time, that can produce something counterintuitive. A weaker system in the short term, a more independent one in the long term. And independence, once achieved, is difficult to reverse. There's also a strategic side effect that doesn't get enough attention. By forcing this kind of adaptation, you're effectively encouraging the development of parallel ecosystems. Alternative supply chains, alternative standards, alternative optimization techniques. They may not match the original system immediately. They don't need to. They just need to function well enough that the gap stops widening. At that point, the leverage shifts. Because controls are most effective when they target dependencies that the other side cannot easily replace. If those dependencies erode, even partially, the power of the controls erodes with them. This is where I'd push back against the more confident narratives on both sides. The optimistic Western take assumes that technological superiority translates directly into strategic control, that if you hold the best chips, you set the pace. The optimistic Chinese take assumes that resilience and scale can substitute for that superiority without significant long-term cost. Both are simplifying something that's becoming more complex. Superior hardware still matters, a lot. It shapes what's possible at the frontier. But system-level adaptability is starting to matter in a different way. How quickly you can reroute, reassemble, and redefine what good enough looks like under pressure. Right now, China seems to be building competence in that second category, not as a choice, as a necessity. I'll put my own position on the table because this is where it matters. I don't think the controls fail. They're doing what they were designed to do in the short term, creating friction, slowing access, raising costs. But I also don't think they achieve the strategic outcome many expect. They don't freeze capability, they reshape it. And that reshaping process is already underway in ways that are harder to quantify than shipment volumes or benchmark scores. There's a question sitting underneath all of this that I don't think has a clean answer yet. If you force a system to operate without visibility, without optimal inputs, without direct access to the best tools, do you weaken it? Or do you train it to survive in conditions where your own system would struggle? I'm not certain. But the trajectory suggests the second outcome is at least partially true. So the next few years won't be defined by a single breakthrough or a single policy shift. It'll be defined by accumulation, small adjustments, quiet investments, incremental gains that don't look decisive on their own, until suddenly they add up to something that looks a lot like continuity under constraint. And that's harder to reverse than a headline setback. If you're watching this space closely, don't just track the chips you can see. Pay attention to the ones that never show up in the data. Those are the ones rewriting the system.